Everybody. I'm sorry we got started a few minutes late again. I had some kind of issue with the Facebook stream. It didn't start when I hit the live button. I don't know why. Sorry about that. But tonight I thought I'd play some of the real classic ragtime pieces for you. And I haven't done a whole night that's truly the classic rags of Scott Joplin, James Scott, and Joseph Lamb. So I thought that would be a fun theme for tonight's concert. And that first one was Joplin's Easy Winners from 1901. It's always been one of my favorites. And I won't stick strictly to that kind of music, of course. Send in requests if you want, but that's kind of the theme for the night. And I do know quite a bit of Joplin's music by heart, much less of James Scott and Joseph Lamb. They're known as the Big Three Ragtime Writers, the greatest of the ragtime writers as far as musical quality is concerned. And that's the way historians look at it. Hey Craig, good morning in Australia. I have a guest with me tonight, by the way. Sitting over here on the couch is an old friend, a good friend, Nick Taylor, who's a ragtime pianist. And I've known Nick since I was probably about, maybe 12 years old. He was one of the judges at the Old Time Piano Championship in Peoria. First couple of years I went there. John Rimmers is watching. Hi, John. Let me check the YouTube stream. Hey, Joe. How nice to have you all watching. Well, let me do one of the other early Joplin rags. I was, hold on a minute. Not quite good enough. That's a little better. Don't want my head to be cut off. Johnny Maddox made a comment to me one time that I thought was very interesting about Joplin's music in particular. He said that he loved the early Joplin. And I thought about it, and it really made sense to me. I also agree with it because later on in Joplin's life, he became very ill. He was very frustrated when he was trying to write his opera. And the later Joplin music can be kind of moody and dark in nature. Now, the early Joplin is very upbeat and happy, and that's definitely the ones that I prefer. I love them all, of course, but I'm going to start out with some of the early Joplin rags. And next up is Swipesy Cakewalk, which Joplin wrote actually when he still lived in Sedalia. It was before he moved to St. Louis. He wrote it with his student Arthur Marshall. And Arthur Marshall said that when they wrote it, the only thing they had to practice on was in one of those old square grand pianos in his house. And I'll tell you more about Swipesy in a minute. Let me play it for you. Oh, that's the Swipesy Cakewalk. And I was going to tell you the story behind that piece. Arthur Marshall said that when they wrote the piece, they didn't have a name for it, and so they were in John Stark. He was Joplin's primary music publisher, and they were in the music publishing office, and a little black boy out in the street stole a newspaper. And so someone said, swiped a newspaper. They said, let's call it Swipesy. That's the story. And I really fell in love with that piece when I was visiting Trevor Tishner at his house in St. Louis for the first time. I had asked him to dig out the interview that he recorded on an old reel-to-reel tape with Arthur Marshall in Sedalia, Missouri back in 1959. And getting to hear that with Trevor, who was there and met Mr. Marshall, was very special. And Bob Darch interviewed him and played Swipesy Cakewalk on the tape, and I just will always remember hearing that for the first time, and so I learned Swipesy shortly after that. And anyhow, looks like people are having trouble with the Facebook feed. Let me double check on that. No, looks like Facebook is working fine, as far as I can tell. I did have some trouble getting it started tonight, which was odd. And hi to Rick and Jody. I want to play a piece that I meant to play last week. This is one of my mother's favorite songs, and I told her I would play this. I'd forgotten about it. This is not Joplin, but I'm going to do several pieces written by Joplin's piano students. He had a number of piano students, and supposedly the first white piano student that he had was a man named Brun Campbell, who I think he was from Oklahoma. And Brun Campbell was kind of an unknown itinerant piano player, played in saloons and bars. He claimed that he played for Buffalo Bill and I think Teddy Roosevelt too, but anyhow, he made records later in his life in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And one of the best ones was a piece that he called Chestnut Street in the 90s. He was referring to Chestnut Street and St. Louis in the 1890s, the sounds that you would have heard walking up and down Chestnut Street. So here's Brun Campbell's Chestnut Street in the 90s. Chestnut Street in the 90s. Thank you very much, folks. So that one, I meant to play that last week for Mother's Day. Anyhow, I think it's appropriate to play music by some of Joplin's students and his associates as well. What else? And by the way, I usually about 2 or 3 songs in, I mention I do these virtual concerts for tips. And if you're so inclined, I have both PayPal and Venmo. I really appreciate that. Yes, I know the Facebook stream is darker. I forgot to bring my lamp in tonight. I usually set up a lamp that helps. Too late now. The YouTube stream should look fine, and that is left up indefinitely too. You can watch it anytime. Here sitting on the piano is my original copy of Sunflower Slow Drag by Scott Joplin and his piano student Scott Hayden, which was written after Joplin moved to St. Louis. I don't know if Scott Hayden did or not. And published in 1901. And in fact, Johnny found this original copy at the antique store here in Durango for me. And it's one of the only Joplin pieces that Johnny ever played. He played it all the time, outside of Maple Leaf Rag and the Entertainer, of course. So I thought I'd play it for you now. And it is called Slow Drag, but I sort of play it at a medium tempo. We can discuss my opinions on the tempos for this kind of music. There's always been a lot of debate about it. Not that it really matters a whole lot. Here's the Sunflower Slow Drag, one of the happy pieces from early in Joplin's career. I think he married Scott Hayden's sister. Belle Hayden, I think was her name, and he was, they said that all of his geese were swans at that time in his life. So that's one of the reasons I love this piece, the Sunflower Slow Drag. Thank you, Nick, and thank you in the virtual world. Yeah, that makes sense. Zeno, I'm not used to seeing your name as Zeno. That's my friend, Blind Boy Paxton, who lives in New York City. It makes more sense that slow drag was a dance. Ragtime was very much dance music, which is another reason I argue from a historical perspective that it was not really meant to be played all that slow. You'll find in the sheet music for a lot of Scott Joplin's compositions, do not play fast. It is never right to play ragtime fast. Well, academics who don't know what they're talking about and don't know any other music from that period in history or that time period, they will argue that, oh, well, it's supposed to be played slow and supposed to be played exactly as Joplin notated it, just like a piece of Bach would be played. But it's really not, it's not the way they did it in the original ragtime era on records or piano rolls. And furthermore, there's no way to prove that Scott Joplin wrote that on his music. It very well could have been the music publisher, John Stark. Mr. Stark was an old man from Kentucky who loved the classics. And he's the one that came up with the term classic ragtime. It doesn't mean classical music. It just means that this is the best of ragtime. And yeah, that's right. Nicholas says, those academics, I tell you. Yeah, Joplin meant bluegrass tempo. Well, that's about right, really. There are certain pieces that just naturally sound better at a slower tempo. I'm thinking about playing Heliotrope Bouquet later tonight. Or I've never played Joplin's Solace, which is a tango, but that's another one that is just, it's obvious that that piece is meant to be slow and beautiful. But generally speaking, ragtime is upbeat music, which is something. So one reason I love it. Yeah, afraid I've already played Easy Winners. I got a request for Peacherine Rag. Yeah, I was planning on playing that anyway. Maybe I'll do it now. Peacherine Rag, written by Scott Joplin in 1901. My friend Andrew Green used this as the title of his ragtime orchestra, Peacherine Ragtime Orchestra, because it's a wonderful upbeat piece. It was one of Johnny's favorites too. And I'm not sure if peacherine is a real fruit or not. I think it may actually be a fruit, but it was also a term that was used for a beautiful woman back at the turn of the century. So it could have multiple meanings, I don't know. Peacherine Rag. There's the Peacherine Rag. Thank you, everybody. And, well, you know, hearing that just kind of makes me miss the Sedalia Ragtime Festival. Walking down the streets of the old 1900s Main Street in Sedalia and hearing dozens of people playing that kind of music. I really miss that in the summer. Normally the festival would be the first week of June. Here's hoping that it happens in 2022. I really miss that. It's I love the ragtime festivals. I'm concerned that some of them are, you know, the audience is kind of dying off, but they're really special and joyful events that certainly changed my life when I started going to them. That's how I met Nick sitting over here. He's got the most adorable little dog named Maggie, by the way. It has been a real treat to have them here this weekend. Well, Scott Joplin, you know, he didn't just play the piano. He didn't just write piano rags. He wrote, well, it's not a polite term now, but he wrote coon songs, ragtime songs, and he wrote waltzes. He wrote apparently a symphony and 2 ragtime operas. Personally, I don't think Trementia is that great when you compare it to like the romantic operas of Puccini and so forth. But he was very gifted, very talented. He played early on. Joplin was born near Texarkana, Texas. We believe more likely in 1867 than 1868, and he toured with a group called the Texas Medley Quartet, a vocal group which had 8 guys in it. I don't. And he played violin, played fiddle, and he sang, and traveled a lot. He traveled and played. Those who knew him said that he really didn't want to play in saloons. He preferred more formal environments, and later on in his life, I think he mostly taught piano lessons. That's how he made a living. But here's one of Joplin's other early works that I've always loved, and this one is very interesting because it was published in Sedalia. He only lived there for a short time. Came out a couple of years after he left Sedalia. He probably still had friends there. And it's called The Favorite, a ragtime 2-step, published by A.W. Perry and Sons in Sedalia, Missouri, 1904. by Scott Joplin. I feel very lucky to have an original copy of that. I think it's probably one of the more rare Joplin pieces, and it's just doubly interesting to me since it was published in Sedalia. Later on, Joplin moved to St. Louis, and then he moved on to New York City, I think in about 1907 or 1908. Yeah, I'm going to do some more of the Joplin. I do want to vary it up a little bit, though. Yeah, and I'll do Pineapple for you. I know that one by heart. Maybe a little later on in the program. When I do my concerts, I love to do them almost chronologically, kind of go through music history. Let me check the Facebook here for any requests. Well, let me play one more Scott Joplin piece, and then we'll move on to a different composer for a minute. Joplin, as I said, he wrote many kinds of music, and you can definitely hear like fiddle playing and so forth, that influence on his rags. Even early on in his career, I think he had kind of high aspirations. And when he lived in Sedalia, he tried writing a ragtime ballet, and it was called the Ragtime Dance. And it was performed and it published as a song and a piano instrumental. The piano instrumental didn't come out until 1906. Let me play that for you now. The Ragtime Dance by Scott Joplin. Nick was trying to help me stomp back there. You're supposed to stomp your feet in certain places during the stop time. That's fun. The Ragtime Dance by Scott Joplin. Well, let's see what else. Oh yeah, it's time to move on to one of the other composers for sure. And the first one to come along after Scott Joplin was a man named James Scott, who grew up in the Carthage, Missouri area. It was from southwest Missouri. And according to one of the early historians, Bob Darch, he was known as Jimmy Scott to his friends and relatives. It's probably a better term for him than the formal James Scott. But anyway, I think he started, his first published compositions came out about 1904. And then his biggest hit came out in 1906. And it's called the Frog Legs Rag. This was the biggest seller in the catalog of the music publisher John Stark outside of Maple Leaf Rag. In fact, it's very similar to Maple Leaf Rag in many ways, the structure and sound of it, but it was a big seller. It was very popular. It's called the Frog Legs Rag by Jimmy Scott. Here we go. Frog Legs Rag. Thank you, everybody. Yeah, as I mentioned, I don't know a whole lot of the James Scott or the Joseph Lamb pieces by heart, and I realized yesterday I was asking for requests on Facebook, you know, ahead of the show. I've got, in order to learn something and play it in the show, I'm going to need more than 1 day's advance notice. So sorry about that. No, I don't know Sensation or Excelsior by heart. There is another James Scott piece though that I have played many times over the last few years. I've loved it for a long time, and this is written in part by James Scott and in part by Ragtime Bob Darch. He met some of his family in Missouri either in the late 50s or early 60s, and was able to obtain apparently some of Scott's manuscripts. And one of them was entitled the Calliope Rag. And James Scott played the Calliope at the Lakeside Amusement Park in Carthage, Missouri. He played there for about a decade, I think, so we don't know exactly when this was written. Early 1900s, no doubt. And I'm pretty confident, there's debate about it. Personally, I'm pretty confident that at least the first section of the piece, the melody, was written by James Scott. Maybe the second section, I'm not too sure. Bob Darch wrote a short 8-measure trio, and the piece was notated by the ragtime composer Donald Ashwander. He wrote out the music by hand, which was published in the book They All Played Ragtime. All of that music in that book is his handwritten notation. Anyhow, here's the wonderful Calliope Rag by Jimmy Scott and Ragtime Bob Darch. Calliope Rag, thank you very much. Well, let's see, I see some requests. I'll certainly do some lamb in a bit. I want to play a little bit slower number now. As I mentioned, there are some of the Joplin pieces that sound just beautiful, and were more concert pieces than dance pieces. Ragtime was very much dance music, but as I said, I think Joplin had kind of high aspirations. And I always have respect for the composer's intentions, but you know, I play a lot more than Joplin's music, and usually my goal as a musician is to bring back a certain time period and the style of that period. So most musicians of that period played ragtime very upbeat. You know, they improvised, but not in a contemporary sense of the word. They created their own arrangements. I might fill out some chords here and there, but I usually like to stick pretty close to the melody especially when I play the Joplin music. And here's one of the most beautiful ones he wrote. And this was published in 1907. One of the legendary ragtime musicians who never made any recordings, only had 3 pieces of music that were published and survived. His name was Louis Chavan. Louis Chavan, and apparently was an incredible pianist who played by ear. And they said that whatever Tom Turpin would play, well, Turpin would play it in C and Chavan would put it in B natural. He was that good. And this is the piece for which he is primarily known. It's called Heliotrope Bouquet. It was written in part by Chavan and finished by Scott Joplin. And it's pretty clear that the first 2 sections were written by Chavan and the second 2 by Joplin. You can just, Joplin's musical style is so distinctive. It's very easy to recognize, and so most historians agree on that. Anyhow, here's the beautiful Heliotrope Bouquet, and you can just imagine him playing this in a saloon like the sporting club he belonged to in St. Louis. I can't think of the name of it, but the second section is a little bit more jazzy, and in fact it was reused in the 1920s by Louis Armstrong as part of a recording that he did called the Heebie-Jeebies, the second section of Heliotrope Bouquet. And I like to play that a little bit more up-tempo. Up-tempo isn't the right word, with a little bit more life than the other beautiful sections. Anyhow, that's too much information. Heliotrope Bouquet. Heliotrope Bouquet. Thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm trying to check the comments on both Facebook and YouTube at the same time. It can be kind of hard to do. That's one of the most beautiful Joplin rags, and I promised somebody earlier I was going to do Pineapple Rag. Let me do that next. This was written after Joplin moved to New York in 1908. That was the year Siobhan died. And in any event, this was not published by John Stark. I think he and Joplin had some kind of falling out, slightly. It might have had something to do with the opera he was trying to write. And a lot of people still recognize this because it was used in the movie The Sting, along with about 5 other Scott Joplin works. Oddly enough, Maple Leaf Rag was not in the movie The Sting, but this one was. It's a great one. The Pineapple Rag. Thank you very much. Incidentally, if you're not very familiar with Scott Joplin's music, I think the first CD set I ever bought my mother bought it for me, of Joplin's music was played by John Arpin. I was lucky to actually get to meet him 3 times, and maybe it's because it was the first recordings of Joplin's music that I had heard, or maybe it's just because I like it. I still think his interpretations of Joplin's music are the best. There have been numerous people over the years who have recorded or come close to recording the complete works of Scott Joplin, and I still prefer the way John Arpin interprets them more than anyone else. He sticks pretty darn close to the melody, but adds in just enough harmony and so forth to flesh out the music. You see, the original sheet music that was published in those days in the early 1900s was simplified for the public that bought the music. Professional level pianists would not have played things quite so simply. And so I think John Arpin did a great job on that stuff. I kind of emulate his versions of the Easy Winners and Pineapple Rag, which I just played. And yeah, if you don't mind sending in virtual tips, I sure appreciate that. I have both PayPal and Venmo. It's in the postings on Facebook and YouTube, and I even have a P.O. box for people who prefer the very old-fashioned checks these days. Well, as I said, I'm not going to stick strictly to Joplin, and I know I can't get to everybody's requests. I try my best. I had a request ahead of time from my good friend Craig Mitten in Australia, who leads a ragtime orchestra in Australia, to do some more of James Scott's music. He's Craig's favorite composer, and his works are kind of neglected, honestly. Joplin's music is kind of folksy sounding. Joseph Lamb, we'll talk about him in a bit. His music is much more romantic, like some of the European classical composers. And James Scott is more virtuosic. It's easy to tell just from playing his music that he had quite a great technique as a piano player. And so Craig requested this tune. We're going to do this from 1910. Here's the original sheet music cover. A great old-time Main Street. Just looked like the Facebook stream paused for a minute, but it's back. This is a great turn of the century scene. Looks like the Edwardian era. That's really what the ragtime era was. It wasn't Victorian. It was right in between Victorian and Art Deco. So the Edwardian era. It's what you see at Main Street, USA at Disneyland. Anyhow, here from 1910 is the Hilarity Rag by Jimmy Scott. Thank you very much, everybody. Hope you like that, Craig. Oh, well, I want to do one more James Scott rag for you. This is another one I haven't played in a number of years, actually. Just dug it out earlier this week, and I played this once in the Old Time Piano Contest. Jimmy Scott was the last of the big three of the classic ragtime composers to continue publishing music. I think John Stark published his last rags in about 1922. He continued writing for a long time and was very prolific. And he changed with the times, you know, as everyone had to. After the ragtime era had kind of died and jazz came along, well, Scott led a theater orchestra in Kansas City and played for silent movies throughout the 1920s and 1930s until he died. He died fairly young in the mid to late 1930s, and so here's one of his later rags. He wrote one, oddly enough, called Don't Jazz Me, I'm Music. But it's hard to say whether he named that or it might have been the music publisher, John Stark. He did name many of the classic ragtime compositions. For all three, Joplin, Scott, and Lamb, John Stark named a number of them. This one is from 1919. It's called, fittingly, since jazz had come along, it's called the New Era Rag. And I didn't really have any requests ready to play for Nick tonight since he's sitting here. This one is for Nick. We're going to do, I guess he likes it. It's the New Era Rag. Good, like that one? Thank you. New Era Rag. Well, that's it for the Jimmy Scott portion of the program tonight, for sure. That's all I know. That's all she wrote, as Angela Lansbury would say. Well, we have not even discussed Joseph Lamb yet, so let's move on to Joseph Lamb. he was kind of an outlier in the ragtime, in the community of ragtime composers at that time in the early 1900s, because a lot of the great classic ragtime writers were black, of course, and for some reason ragtime really came out of Missouri. That is truly where the great American music started, was in Missouri. It was not in New Orleans or Chicago or New York or anywhere else. It was in Missouri. But Joseph Lamb lived his whole life in Brooklyn, New York, and he was, I forget what he did for a living, but he did not compose music for a living. He was not a professional musician, and but he could write the most beautiful music, even though it was a hobby for him. And he loved real ragtime and wanted to meet Scott Joplin, and he walked into John Stark's music publishing office in New York City, and there was Mr. Joplin. Apparently his foot was wrapped up with gout at the time, but they became friends, and Scott Joplin put his name as arranger on Lamb's first rag that was published by Stark, Sensation Rag, just to help him out. And I don't know, again, too many of the Lamb rags by heart, but here's one that has always been my favorite. In fact, it was the last piece that Lamb had published during the ragtime era. And it came out the same year as that last composition, 1919. This is the Bohemia Rag by Joseph Lamb. Hey, thank you very much. Bohemia Rag. Hey, Sandy, yeah, I saw that you had requested that earlier, so I was already planning to play it. Now I can say it was just for you. That's the great Joseph Lamb. I'm lucky to be able to say that his precious daughter, Pat Lamb Kahn, has been a good friend of mine since I was 11 years old. I have in my Joseph Lamb sheet music file a letter that she wrote me when I was 11 years old. So I know we've been friends that long. She is now in her upper 90s and in assisted living near her home where she lived in Connecticut. But Pat is a sweetheart, and I was very lucky just a couple of years ago to be able to discover. I found a recorded interview with the composer, Joseph Lamb, that no one had ever heard before. Hey, Jerry and Mary Grace, I'm glad you're listening tonight. I'm talking about the time that you took me to Smiley Wallace's house in Kansas City, and I discovered a reel-to-reel tape of an interview with Joseph Lamb that no one had ever heard before. And that's the interesting thing about Lamb. You see, he outlived Joplin and James Scott by many decades, and so there were historians and musicians that were able to interview him who became interested in the ragtime era, and Lamb composed many pieces in later life that were then published and discovered after he died. They're wonderful pieces of music, and Lamb wrote some really brilliant novelty piano solos in the 1920s, and they were never published. He wrote them for Mills Music, which was one of the biggest music publishers of that period, Mills Music in New York City. And I think there were about 15 novelty piano solos that he wrote. They were never published. But all the names of all of those pieces are listed in the book. They all played ragtime. And when I found this tape, on the back of this reel-to-reel tape, it had listed the names of the pieces that Lamb played on the tape in the interview with Bob Darch. And one of the pieces was Waffles. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's one of the pieces of music that Lamb wrote in the 1920s, one of the novelty piano solos that has never been found. And so, unfortunately, Lamb is playing by memory on the tape, and he barely manages to get through very much of the piece. He played through 2 sections of a piece that was not named, a novelty that really wasn't named, and 1 section of Waffles. And so what I did, when I realized that no one had played this, is I took the sections of music that were extant on the tape, and I put them together and arranged the piece myself. So you are about to hear Waffles by Joseph Lamb. I'm still the only one who's ever played this or recorded it, as far as I know. And it's, what survives on the tape was an elderly Lamb playing just a little bit of the piece. And but there's enough of it that it's enjoyable to listen to. And I had the sheet music typeset and printed, and you can order it. Copies from me, only $5 if you want it. that's the piece I discovered by one of these great composers that had never been published and was lost to time. The Waffles. Well, in addition to that, I thought I'd play for you one of the lamb novelties that is more well known and is complete. And so this I've played this for several times, but not in a number of years. I did have the pleasure of playing it for Joe's daughter Pat one time. It's called Hot Cinders. This is a real clever and authentic sounding novelty piano solo by the one and only Joseph Lamb. Hot Cinders. That's a novelty by Joseph Lamb. He was also clearly a versatile composer. Well, I've got some time left tonight, and send in some requests for me, folks. Can't promise I'll get to them all, but maybe at least 2 or 3 here before I quit for the night. Oh, that's right. Joseph Lamb worked. Someone is providing the information here for me that I asked. He says Joseph Lamb worked in the financial part of the garment industry. Yeah, okay, that's what I thought. No, I do not know Magnetic Rag by heart, but I do know Searchlight Rag. So let me do that for you. That's a good one. By Scott Joplin. I'll get that request in here real quick. This was written in 1907 and supposedly named after a little town in Nevada where the Turpin brothers, Tom and his brother Charles Turpin, owned part of a silver mine in Searchlight, Nevada. So here's the Searchlight Rag by Scott Joplin. Thank you very much. Nick and Virtual Land. Well, thank you. Yeah, I got more than one request here for Calico Rag. I might try and play that for you tonight. It's not a classic rag at all, but yeah, I don't know Temptation Rag. Not by heart. I've always loved the piece. Just don't know it by heart. Ah, my friend Ezekiel was watching tonight from Argentina. I can't believe it. I wonder what time of the day it is in Argentina. He asked me to play a piece by Max Morath. I think maybe that's what I'll do next here, folks, because the Youngkins are asking me for Gold Bar Rag, too. So this is a piece by Max Morath. He's, as Ezekiel said, well, he's considered classic now, too. So this is one of Max's early rags, actually written in and named for the Gold Bar Room at the Imperial Hotel in Cripple Creek, Colorado, where he played in the 50s. And I love it. I've had the pleasure of playing it for Max myself. So here's the Gold Bar Rag by Max Morath. Well, I just got an interesting comment here on YouTube from Chris. Someone named Chris. He's asking about what makes something classic ragtime. Well, that's a term that was coined by the music publisher John Stark, who printed a lot of Scott Joplin's music, and it doesn't necessarily mean in the time period of Joplin. It means in the classic style of Joplin. Doesn't mean classical as in classical music. It means just this is musically the best of ragtime, and there were three composers that were more representative of that than anyone: Scott Joplin, James Scott, and Joseph Lamb. And I think I played just about all of the music tonight that I know by all of the three of those composers. I've done the best I can with that, and hope you've all enjoyed the concert tonight. I'm thinking I'm just going to play one more piece for you. Actually, I think it's time for the grand finale. I have something fun that I'm going to do, and this is not classic ragtime at all, and neither was the Max Morath piece I just played, but it is a famous rag. I thought it'd be good to end with. I don't want to give away too much, but I have a friend here in Durango who's a filmmaker, and he's thinking about doing a really professional level music video for me in the Diamond Bell Saloon here in Durango. And I've been trying to think what piece of music would be good to use. One of the biggest YouTube videos that I ever had was Tiger Rag. Unfortunately, it was taken down. And I thought, you know, it might be a good one to use for the music video. And so it had about 500,000 views on YouTube, believe it or not. And so I've been sprucing up my arrangement of Tiger Rag. Now, this is a piece that sort of helped usher on the jazz age. It was first recorded by the original Dixieland Jazz Band in 1917. That was the year Scott Joplin died. And the very first part of Tiger Rag, as the piece developed in New Orleans, and the original Dixieland Jazz Band claimed it. And there's some debate over the authorship of the piece with Jelly Roll Morton. He claimed that he wrote it, but in all likelihood, the piece was developed by multiple musicians in New Orleans over the years. And the first theme of the piece is based on an old French quadrille, which were dances that were popular in New Orleans back in the 19th century. And so I've added on a little bit of the original French quadrille onto Tiger Rag. And then I play a little bit of it in the style of Jelly Roll Morton, and then kind of my own take on it, even in a minor key. So, well, without giving away too much more, here's the good old Tiger Rag. concert for the night, everybody. Thank you very much. That's my Tiger Rag, and I hope you've had fun. I sure have. Thank you so much for listening to all this ancient music, and I know I've played a couple of these several times recently, like Calliope Rag. Hope you heard that, Amy. But it's called classic because it stood the test of time, and I'm going to be back next Sunday night at the same time, same place, with another virtual concert for you. I'm not 100% sure of the theme I'm going to use yet. I'm trying to decide between 2 or 3 that I'm planning in my head here. But I will announce it and let you all know on Facebook, as I always do. And for now, and also if you can leave a tip, I sure appreciate it. Thank you to everyone who's continued to do that every week for a long time now. I don't know what I'd be doing without you. So thank you again, and good night for now, folks. See you next week.